And welcome, everybody. We are so happy to be here talking about the ugly impacts of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. We're looking forward to having some really robust conversation with our panelist, Benjamin Orr, who is president and CEO of the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, and who is an old friend, not old as in age, but old as in our association. I always love when Ben is at the table. And Abraham or Abe Paulos, who is Deputy Director for the Black Alliance of Just Immigration, who is a new friend. And I am really looking forward to the conversation with him because I've already learned so much. And then we have you who are joining us in this space, and we hope will bring your own questions, your comments, your flavor to the space so that all of us can leave today knowing that we are better informed, not only with what the stakes are, with what is in the bill, but also armed with how we can be helpful when we see stuff going down. So, Ben, Abe, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you.
And let's just jump into it. So, Ben, if you can give us kind of the lay of the land about the big, beautiful bill, what is it really about?
Thanks, Adar. Yeah, and I would just first of all say also that if folks are not familiar with my organization, the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank that engages in research and analysis, uh, organizing and coalition work, et cetera, all around the idea that every Marylander should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. And this big, beautiful bill, or HR1, as you'll hear it called, it certainly is not beautiful from our perspective, is in direct opposition to that vision of Maryland. This bill was passed back in July, and some components of it have come into effect. Others are going to take effect over the next couple of years. But very quickly, what's included in this in HR1 is the following. The first is that it takes health insurance away from Marylanders and other Americans and makes it more costly by creating more red tape and barriers to coverage, creating new harsh Medicaid work requirements, and failing to continue the enhanced premium tax credits. You've probably seen a lot of media coverage of that recently. It also takes away health insurance programs from people who've been granted humanitarian protections of various sorts, including refugees and victims of domestic violence, et cetera. It raises the cost of groceries. There are, for the first time, states are going to have to pay between 5 and 15% of SNAP benefits, nutrition assistance benefits, which have previously been 100% paid for by the federal government. We also expect tens of thousands of Marylanders to lose their food assistance because of new and significantly expanded harsh work requirements, and again, taking away food assistance from people who have been granted humanitarian protections, asylees, victims of labor trafficking, et cetera, folks living lawfully in the United States. It passes those costs on to Maryland at a time when we're struggling for a lot of reasons, to fill a budget gap. And it also increases prices, including the prices the state pays, but while cutting jobs in so many different ways, whether it's the loss of clean energy tax credits, the cancellation of 2/3 of planned infrastructure projects, et cetera. And it does all of this in service of one goal, to give more tax cuts to the wealthy. In next year, this HR1 will give the richest 1% of Marylanders. And Maryland's a relatively wealthy state so the 1% in Maryland is folks who make more than $881,000 a year. They'll get an annual tax cut of almost $57,000. Uh, Whereas those Marylanders who earn less than $34,000 will get a tax break of $120, which will be overwhelmed by the fact that they're also bearing the brunt of all these deep cuts to Medicaid and SNAP and other things, as well as the higher prices that we're all facing in the marketplace. And it also specifically leaves children behind. There's a much touted increase in the child tax credit that parents who make work but don't make enough to qualify for the full credit won't benefit from at all. So, and also it takes away eligibility for the child tax credit from U.S. citizen children whose parents may lack a social security number, who had previously been eligible for that, but now don't get that. So I think in broad strokes, that's kind of the essence of the bill that we're facing. At the same time that then we had the government shutdown, and they're now considering the next budget and what additional cuts Republicans in Congress and in this administration may want to make. But for the moment, this is what's on paper. This is what we know, and happy to get into the conversation about in a deeper way about all of those pieces.
Thank you, Ben. So can you talk a little bit about the impact on communities of color? I know that I read that specifically for Black communities, the impact is going to be disproportionate as usual, right? But one thing that you said that really struck me was when you talked about the child tax credit. I was reading that for most Black households, low income Black households, they won't even be eligible because they don't earn enough money. So, can you talk about that for lower income households?
Yeah, it's uh, so there isn't a ton of data about the impacts like with numbers behind it, but what we know is that well, we know two things. One thing we know is I think that most of the people that are going to be impacted by this
Mhm,
are white,
mhm,
um, simply because they're the majority of this country, and there's just more of them. But as you say, the impact is going to disproportionately fall on our Black and brown friends and neighbors and family members. Um, and because of the ways in which it targets poverty and the racist ways in which we've intentionally maintained and expanded poverty in this country, it
mhm.
is very true that the disproportionate impact is on Black and brown communities over and above what their normal, what their expected share of these terrible impacts would be. One area we do, I think, have some sense of is we talked. I didn't even talk about the one of the other major economic impacts over time, which is that the impact on the federal workforce. And Maryland is, of course, particularly dependent on the federal government for its economy. At least 15,000 Marylanders have left the federal workforce so far this year due to layoffs and buyouts. Um, that number is probably much higher now because that number preceded the October ending of the early retirement separation program.
Mhm.
Um, on top of that, that also doesn't account for all the federal grant cuts that have led to layoffs at some institutions like Johns Hopkins and so many other institutions and private contractors that rely on federal funding across the state. Um,
Mhm.
we're seeing major cuts at our public universities. And the federal government has been a pathway to the creation of the Black middle class in Maryland, in other places as well, but particularly in Maryland, in important ways. And the early reports suggest that these attacks on the federal government, on the federal workforce, have disproportionately affected Black women in particular, who make up a sizable portion of that workforce. So um, there is an intentional, I don't think it's by happenstance that these cuts and these economic attacks are targeting Black and brown communities.
Mm. Thank you. And asking because we know that Maryland is a majority minority state. So if the cuts and the impacts of this bill is disproportionately on Black and brown people, and we know that Maryland is a majority minority state, then there will be disproportionate impacts on the state budget, right? In trying to shore up or mitigate the impacts that Maryland families and individuals and children are experiencing.
No, that's absolutely right. There's so many. I'm sure uh, we'll bring Abraham into the conversation here as well. And Maryland is not only a majority minority state, but it's a heavily immigrant state.
Yeah.
About 17% of our state's population are immigrants. And there are the targeted attacks on people who are working but struggling to make ends meet, on children, um, uh, especially Black and brown children, on immigrants, both in terms of specifically stripping out their eligibility for certain programs that they were currently eligible for, and the ramping up of funding for immigration enforcement, and
Mhm.
the subsequent like um, uh, uh, cr creation of a fearful environment in our communities. Maryland depends on immigrants for our population growth, for our economic growth, for the creation of new small businesses in the state. And so all of this together creates significant economic challenges for communities, for household families, but also for the state as a whole as we face a $1.4 billion budget deficit next year.
And that's a great segue, for me to turn to you because just a couple of things when I was reading the One Big Beautiful Bill, um, one thing that caught my eye was the changes that really impacted immigrants. There's been all of this conversation about illegal immigrants into our country. Well, when you look at the bill and you look at how filing fees and other fees have been increased in that bill. Some have been doubled. And so, on the one hand, there is all of this conversation about illegal this, illegal that. On the other hand, there is a truncation of viable pathways for people to move into a quote unquote legal status. Um, can you talk a little bit about that in the Big Beautiful Bill? And another thing, if you can talk about, is just this whole history of, or the mythological narrative of this country being a quote unquote white country. And historically, the ways in which immigration laws and policies have been conceived and implemented has caused that which we believe was one of natural selection, or it was just the way it was meant to be. If you can bring us up to speed or give us a little bit of history about that too, please.
Absolutely. So I think overall, the point that I'm going to land on, I think with the big beautiful bill is just sort of really looking at this, sort of this public charge vibe that the bill has, right? That Ben did such a great job breaking down the child tax credit, right? And overall, really criminalizing poverty, which is something that has been a part of the narrative that we're seeing here. And then the second part about the triple B, right? The big bill is I'm going to bring in enforcement, right? And so those are going to be the two ways that I'm going to try to tie in sort of this immigration context to it. It'll be a little bit of a long walk, but we will get there. And then just to sort of back up, I think I always want to clear a couple of things up with this idea around immigrants, right? Like, so being an immigrant is a very fluid thing in this country. You could come and be an immigrant, but then 7 years, you're a citizen, right? So this idea that the immigrant is sort of this static, just person just for 100 years is an immigrant isn't actually true at all. And we've seen this throughout the history of America, right? The point that I will start with and to talk about this narrative of America, I really want to root it in the truth of it, right? Citizenship in this country has always been fought for by Black people, by the Black liberation struggle from the beginning, right? Even in the first act of 1791, right? That's the Naturalization Act of who is a citizen and who isn't. It excluded two big groups. It excluded the indigenous population that was here, brown people, right? And it stole their land. And then it excluded black people that were enslaved. So they stole people to work that stolen land. And until like America as a country gets to that, we will always be in what they consider the original sin, right? And so I think citizenship to me usually starts there with the exclusion of black and brown people. And even to this day, when you see incarceration rates, those two populations, brown people and black people, are disproportionately locked up. So it goes to show that the idea of an American was always about excluding black people, excluding brown people. And mass incarceration and incarceration is the physical manifestation of excluding Black people from social, political, and economic life in this country, right? And everything that has happened that is positive around immigration in this country, right, from my perspective, is because of the Black liberation struggle. Even when we start with the first Civil Rights Act of 1866, that did two things, right? One, it gave us the famous 14th Amendment, which basically says that anybody that is born in this country is an American citizen. And it also gave us the clause around everyone's equal underneath the law, right? So that means that if you are here in this country, right, the Constitution does protect you. It does not just say it protects citizens and that's it, and it protects immigrants in a different way. Everybody is protected. So when things like the big bill go down, everyone is affected in the country, regardless of immigration status, right? The one sort of other immigration act that I do want to point out is the Immigration Act of 1924. Why is this act really important? Because it really racialized, right, what they wanted America to be. And what the Immigration Quota Act did is it just basically said we only want white people from Europe. It was based on eugenics, right? And it was such a great bill for white supremacists and white nationalists that the Nazis loved it. They admired the 1924 Immigration Quota Act because they felt that this is how you get a white country. Jim Crow, segregation, and the 1924 Immigration Act. And what's crazy about it, I always like to remind people in the infamous sort of campaign rally that happened in Madison Square Garden last year, where Stephen Miller, that ghoul, right, goes and say, America for Americans. That is a quote from the eugenics movement by Lillian Russell, right, who basically said, we just want America for Americans. And so you start to see that connection between what the ideal America is and the type of legislation that folks are passing to make that so, right? And lastly, the 1960s, right, which was a point in which folks were challenging white supremacy and a lot of other things, whether it was the feminist movement, we had the Black Panthers and what have you. The main important part that I always want to stress about that challenging to white supremacy and how it made America the America that we see right now is we all know the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but there was also an Immigration Act that passed in 1965, right? That basically did away with the 1924 Immigration Quota Act. Why is that important? In 1965, about 77% of immigrants were white people from Europe, right? 10, 15 years later, it was about that number started to decrease. By the 1980s, right? 80% of immigrants were black and brown people coming from Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and South America. In 2022, just 3 years ago, right? 90% of immigrants coming to this country are black and brown people coming from Africa, Asia, South and Central America. Now we have an invasion, right? When you start to see now immigration is a problem. And I would argue, I don't think that that's the problem of immigration, having people come here. I think the problem is that black and brown people are now, starting to come into this country that is challenging that white ethno state that a lot of these folks, the regime, sort of has this affinity towards, right? And lastly, just for the last part about the context, so I want to talk a little bit about the 80s and 90s because I think that the big bill really reflects around sort of the narrative that has been pushing legislation sort of in Congress when it comes down to poor people and when it comes down to black and brown people. So in the 90s, what we sort of see is sort of this creation of monsters and Congress going to war with it, right? And so we saw the creation of the crackhead and Congress saying, we're going to have a war on drugs, right? And that's not being hyperbolic. That's what Congress had said. We also sort of see the creation of sort of the welfare queen, right? In which we start to see little bits of it in the big bill around, sort of the public charge, the poverty folks, and what have you, right? And so that creation of the welfare queen, right, gave us the Welfare Act of the 90s, the super predator, right? And we start to see that with the 1994 crime bill, right? So it's like this creation of monsters and passing legislation, right? And that monster, again, to be honest, for America has always been a black person, right? And then shades of that, right? Then it goes to being brown or whatever. But that creation is always there. And then the legislation and the approach to policy has always been essentially sort of one of warfare, right? One of basically excluding them from political, social, and economic life out of sort of out of the United States. And now we're back to this big bill, right? I did say it was going to be a long walk, but I'm glad that we're here now, right? And
We
so
got our walking shoes. We got
okay,
our walking shoes,
awesome.
Abe. Keep
Okay.
going.
Okay, great. And so all of the things that Ben had really talked about, looking at sort of the child tax credit, looking at the idea of how, America really looks at poor people and black and brown people as if it is their own problem, right? As if this is a problem around laziness, right? Again, that's also a part of the narrative of the monster, right? Lazy, violent person that can't do for themselves, that either needs to be locked up or take away their social services. And lastly, I want to talk about it in enforcement, right? Because I really do think what the big bill does is that it essentially um, becomes sort of the final stage in the Frankenstein, if we're going to use that monster analogy. And it is given enforcement, right? $171 billion dollars. The Pentagon in the same bill, right, gets about $138 billion, dollars, right? And the enforcement is within, right? This is interior enforcement, right? And the Pentagon is obviously everything military. Now, the big difference is that the Pentagon budget is for 1 year, right? And that the enforcement budget for Department of Homeland Security in general, right, is for it to spread around 4 years, right? And so those are some of the technical differences. But the overall, right, the overall approach to it is that the same approach that gave us mass incarceration. And so what we're starting to see is that there has always been I would say, sort of like income. There's always been money, right, to sort of lock us up. There's always been money to do that. And you can see that with Immigration Customs Enforcement getting about $30 billion, right? And this is to quote unquote do this immigration enforcement. And like I said, it is really an enforcement that's based on racialized violence, right? We see them in Memphis. African Americans are the ones getting pulled over, ICE pulling over the traffic tickets, and and what have you. We see it in DC, we see it in LA, we also see it in Chicago, right? So this idea that they're going to go out there for immigration enforcement, it's actually kind of like a red herring in a way, because it's actually like they're actually just going to go out there and harass black and brown people and try to put them again into a system, right, of incarceration, of a carceral state, right? Because we've got $171 billion for that, but we don't have $171 billion to help people out, right, in any type of way. And so what we're seeing, and and I always think about this in that sort of lens, that these the narrative of the 90s, right? This regime just kind of like latched back onto it and was like, okay, now we can design a system of finance and economics, but also a system of governing, right? Which is authoritarian and I would say fascist-like, right? To be able to sort of continue that thread of excluding black and brown people in one way or another. So I think the bill actually is part of a long pattern, a long story that kind of manifests itself in a way that they don't have to hide it anymore.
Wow. I mean, so many thoughts. And the thing that really stands out for me and why I so appreciate the fact that you took us on this long walk down history lane is because this country as a whole tends to forget that what we're seeing now is not new. That what we're seeing now is building upon what we have seen from the beginning, right? It is always so interesting to me, and I'm using this example because you brought this up, Abe. When people talk about, oh my goodness, these are Nazis, these are Nazis. And I keep saying, no, most accurately, we should be saying, these are Americans. This is America. Because the Nazis took their inspiration from US laws, policies, and customs, which were at that time the most restrictive and harsh of anywhere in the world. That's where the Nazis came here to infuse what America had in terms of how it dealt with its Black and Native populations into their laws. So and maybe Abe, this gets back to your statement that until America begins to really look at and reconcile its histories toward Native and Black people, it will always be in some state of denying or just on the surface dealing with its original sin, because it is easier for us to say, no, this isn't us, it's really them, it's really Nazi behavior, instead of us saying, no, this is US behavior. We can trace the through lines in US history right here. America does not want to say that at all. The other thing is, I really appreciate your bringing up the fact that immigration is really fluid, that people come as immigrants, but then they become U.S. citizens, right? It's not that people remain immigrants all of their lives. Although with the rhetoric now, there does seem to be this distinction that if you are an immigrant, that is going to be permanent status for you, that you really aren't the real Americans because the real Americans are white. And so this whole drive to question birthright citizenship is part of that or can be seen as part of that. When we talk about fascism, which is a term that's being thrown about as if it's new, And in 1936, Langston Hughes said, and I quote, fascism is a new name for that kind of terror the Negro has always faced in America. So even when we talk about that and that as a system or the United States having components of fascism in its system, for Native and Black people, this is not new. It has always been. And finally, I really appreciate your acknowledgement that it has been Black liberation movements that have birthed offshoots, right? If we talk about feminism, the feminist movement, if we talk about Chicano movement, if we talk about queer movements, all of them were on the back of the Black liberation movement, which provided a blueprint and a model of how to resist um, um, America's racialization. So again, when you talk now about the implementation of it, about how the budget for ICE has just exploded, and when we also see that this web is not just targeting the worst of the worst, which was the rhetoric, and it's not just targeting immigrants anymore. It is also targeting anyone who stands in opposition to it. And so, if you can speak a little bit about what you're seeing, and then I see that Mark has a question or comment, and we'll take that. But what are your thoughts about that in terms of, this not just being about immigrants anymore, but really the people who find themselves in that web of immigration enforcement are increasingly people who are citizens.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I appreciate you talking about the how immigration is very, very fluid because it is. I mean, I think that the Somali recent upkeep, 87% of foreign-born Somalis are U.S. citizen. In fact, 60% of the Somali population are U.S. born citizens. So only a small percentage of them, right? Are actually immigrants. In fact, the great majority of them, almost like 90% of them are actually US citizens. So thank you for that. The second part sort of about what we're seeing when we're starting to see US citizens get wrapped up. And again, this is not about US citizens, right? When they came out, this was not about immigrants, right? When they came out, they were like, we now have a mandate to harass Black people and brown people sort of in the street. And I can tell you this, that even in New York, but then even in the way that the law enforcement folks are getting together, 1 in 4 DEA agents are doing immigration work, right? So 1 in 4 DEA stands for Drug Enforcement Administration, right? 80% of the alcohol, tobacco, firearm agency, right, is doing immigration work. The IRS, right, are getting pushed to do immigration work. The Postal Service folks are getting pushed to do, right? And I think for a moment, take out the immigration part about the immigration enforcement. It's just enforcement, right? Which is getting us to a place, and I love that Langston Hughes sort of comment because it is, right? It's this idea that Black people have been policed in this country in a way, right, that hasn't always been acknowledged and recognized. And then now what we're seeing sort of out there in the street, right, is that level of just sort of brazen, we're gonna break up families in front of you, right? Black people have been going through that for the longest right part. In fact, that breaking up of the family, the separation of families has sort of been a policy, a US policy, right? And we can see it not just in enforcement, but then also with, again, with poverty, right? With this idea of the public charge, separating people, saying you can't have SNAP benefits, you can't be in housing anymore because you have a felony, right? And so I think that that's kind of, again, that long-standing what we're saying. And I think I want people to understand that when they're going out there, right, to sort of say, oh, they're only going after immigrants or Mexicans or whatever have you. No, no, no. This is about the soul of America being played out right now in the street, right, where we're starting to see rights that are getting violated, whether it's the First, Second Amendment, right? I mean, not well, the Second Amendment they love so much, right? But the first, right, freedom of speech, the fourth. freedom not to be searched. They're going out there without warrants, right? And also the Fifth Amendment, right? Which basically says that you can stay quiet when you want to. So what we're sort of seeing, right, under the guise, the Trojan horse might be immigration today, right? But really what they're really trying to do is erode, right? I would say structures of civil society and governing where all that's left, right, will be the streets for us to say, we don't want the big bill to destroy our communities, right? We didn't have that in any of the branches of government to help us stop that right now, right? And so once they control that, then we're really looking at a society that isn't democratic at all, right? And it hasn't been for Black folks, right? But at least Black folks have been fighting for it. And so I think I really want people to understand that this is about us and it's that original sin, right? That is now rearing its ugly head. And I think we've got to find a way to not just say not now, but also like not again.
Mhm. And for the Second Amendment, they're in love with the Second Amendment for white people. California famously changed its laws in the 60s when Black Panthers started exercising their right to the Second Amendment to carry guns. And then all of a sudden it was, oh, heck to the no, we're not having this here. So Second Amendment for white people.
Well, there's
Um,
even a more recent example of that because this administration proposed removing Second Amendment rights from LGBTQ individuals, especially trans individuals, just in the last year. So even that's not sacred for them when it is an outgroup, someone they consider less than human.
Thank
But
you. So unless it's for straight white men
yeah.
and straight white women. Yeah. Mark, you're on mute.
Okay. Um, Sadly, if the more often we bring race into the discussion, there are too many people in this country that don't want to hear it. And not that it shouldn't be discussed, but
Mhm,
I think for many of these same people that don't want to hear about race,
mhm,
do want to hear about freedom and democracy.
mhm,
And we know democracy's under siege. And if you look at the dictators around the world, the one thing they fear is a democracy because they'll be booted out. I happen to do volunteer work with a Ukrainian organization, and I've learned from them that in Russia, Trump's nickname is Marionetka Putina, which translates as Putin's puppet.
mhm,
And can you imagine if the 70 million people that didn't vote for Trump were all on the street shouting Putin's puppet? But we will, many of these people that have rewritten or trying to rewrite our racial history still want a democracy. And
mhm,
I just, sadly, we need to enlarge the conversation to talk about the threat to all Americans in our democracy, not to sweep race under the table,
mhm.
but I think we've got a better chance of winning more people over.
If
Thank you, Ben.
I think that there are, I have a couple of thoughts in response to the question. I mean, I think one of the things that we spend a lot of time looking at, in addition to data and public policy and economic research, is communications research. And what the communications research actually shows is that um, whether we talk about race or not, Americans know it's in the background, and we're actually more effective when we speak plainly. When we're trying to move these issues forward, whether it's democracy or anything else. And certainly democracy is under attack. The other thing that is, I think, vital for an organization like mine, um, white led, obviously, as I'm the CEO, is and also entirely devoid of federal grants right now, is that there are fewer and fewer of us who can speak out about race. And um, if your organization receives federal grants right now, you're really restricted in what you can say because of this administration's attacks on DEI programs in ways too numerous to count. Uh, if you want to survive as an organization, if you want to still have jobs for your employees and preserve those federal dollars. And so I think it's incumbent on those of us who aren't under those sorts of threats to continue to speak out and to continue to bring it to the fore. And that it isn't, even if people profess that they're uncomfortable about it, they're not ignorant of the fact that this is a central part of the American experience. And that when we look at communications research about what messages are effective, what framing is effective, shying away from talking about race does not improve our chances of persuading the other side or making effective policy change. So that, you may each of us may make different decisions in different conversations with different people. And certainly here in Maryland, we're at a little bit different situation than my counterparts in um, other states perhaps might be, although race is also central to the Maryland experience. But I think overall, we don't do ourselves any favors by shying away from, and we ignore the lessons we can learn from history if we shy away from race. And I know that would be what you would hear from the communications experts that we interact with.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
that, Ben. Um, that was so. Thank you for that, Ben. That was like a great answer. I had other things, but I was like, you basically knocked it on the park. But then even talking about communications and messaging, and Mark and I appreciate you bringing up, sort of the term freedom and democracy, and I'll get into that. But even this whole idea about sort of like race and how it is so central, right? It is so central that, this regime is going into museums to try to like make us forget about slavery that even happened, right? We've got more than 500,000 Black women that are out of a job, right? And that you can't look at that and be like, well, I don't know if this is the way to do it. But obviously, race is very important to the regime, and in fact, it's this tip of their spear, right? And then to talk a little bit about the term freedom and democracy, even on a messaging tip, right? I think that when particularly like as immigrants or whatever, when folks hear the word freedom, particularly in the American context, right? It is always in the context. The first time we've heard it was freedom of Black people while they were enslaved, right? And that whole idea, sure, the Constitution has like freedom of speech, right? But it's really based on liberty. And that American Revolution was basically like, we don't want to get taxed or whatever. But the core sort of messaging around freedom, right, has always been pushed by Black people, and even the term democracy, right? Which is again, thanks to the Black Liberation Movement, that even from a lot of different places, but even in the Civil Rights Act, even in that in itself, essentially made democracy what it is, right? To make sure that people can function in a democratic institution without having race, gender, religion, or whatever have you. And so I think we actually need to double down, right, on the race and actually get busy, start to get active with it. And the idea of freedom, even as a messaging term, to leave you on, there's the saying out there that says, those that have been denied freedom know freedom the most, right? And I think looking at the Black struggle here in America, even as an immigrant, I think that that's like really important, and how that rings true when it comes down to messaging.
Mhm. There is a piece of discussions that I always feel, or that I have seen, have been kind of left out of the social interactions or conversations, right? And that is, what does it say about a country where we have to shy away from something that is so central for white people to feel comfortable and feel like they want to step into the game of justice and freedom and democracy? What does it say if we have to temper our conversations and ignore the elephant in the room so that white people won't get up and leave, or so that they will feel that they have skin in the game? That is a real important piece of conversation that we need to have, even as we talk about these issues, because if we don't, then who whose freedom are we talking about? For whom? We're talking about democracy for whom? And again, I go back to the 1936 quote of Langston Hughes, that fascism is just a new name for the type of horror and oppression that Black people have always labored under in the United States. And it also goes back, Abe, for me, to what you said, which is that until this country is willing to honestly look at and face its original sin, we're always going to be having these circular conversations where we have to leave out the centerpiece of it because it discomforts and disquiets white people, right? There's something that needs to be examined in that. And where we're more comfortable talking about the 70 million people who didn't vote, rather than talking about that white voters were the only racial demographic of voters who voted for a person who was saying the same things during the campaign as he is saying now when he is in office. And that those things were not a deal breaker for any racial group, right? Or that they were a deal breaker for every racial group other than for the majority of white voters who voted.
Absolutely.
The
I mean,
the a candidate other than a Republican presidential candidate has never won the majority of the white vote since the 1964-65 Civil Rights Act was passed. White voters since that time, the majority of them have always voted for the candidate in the party that was championing some type of racial oppression. That is a long history. And again, we have to be comfortable talking about that. And that is not a Black and non-Black people of color conversation. That's a white people conversation that needs to be had. Because we can't talk about democracy or freedom if we're not talking about those choices too, and that history too. So all of that ties into this conversation and discussion. So I want to stop there, and we've not Mark started us off with questions and remarks. I want to open the floor to John and to Erica and to Quentin, to see where are you all with the conversation and what has been said thus far, and do you all have any specific questions or knowledge or learnings that you would like to share with us, Quentin?
Uh, I didn't expect to speak, but I'm somewhat moved by what was just shared,
Mhm.
actually. I was actually affected by what was shared earlier. Um, it's interesting how sometimes one's mood shift or one's thinking can shift, which is actually very meta to the whole process of trying to create political change at different levels. But I was very moved by what you just said, and I just didn't expect that. Of course, I'm one to double check certain aspects of that for myself because that's how I am.
Mhm.
But there's something also in me that knows that is true. even if there are details that I might sort of like the wording is different. And what I mean by that is that in the times that I participated in talking to people who were of different racial backgrounds,
Mhm.
my mind felt that their conditioning was speaking for them, um, and the system was speaking for them. I
Mhm.
never tried to challenge or ask them to contemplate the idea what winning really looks like for them in terms of political change. Like, what do they imagine their lives to be like, or that of their neighbor? And to sort of excavate, is that where we also really want to go together, or is it that where they want to go? And that isn't real democracy. If the vision is still based on capitulating and maybe persuading people come back to where they want to go and sort of let you be in your own lane as long as I know that you're relatively safe, but this is still my vision. It still speaks to moral individuality, which to me is also something that doesn't get addressed, that there's a bedrock of what this means because ethics is not really racial ethics. They're not really taught at a very early age. And so you get people who are in their 60s or in their late 40s, perhaps, being the ones who teach their grandchildren, these values, when maybe their values are starting at a place that the children may grow up to looking at things from an individual perspective of liberalism rather than an inclusive perspective of how these other people who are physically different in that other sense want to live. That here's justice, but it is still an individualized justice that I'm fighting for. I'm not looking for a collective sense of justice because I'm still in this sense of winning. And winning might be a form of domination. And
Mhm.
how does that feel? How does it feel to fuel, perhaps let all this disparate disagreement be the fuel for collectivism rather than I have to correct every situation. I have to make sure that the person who's with me is with me on an individual level rather than in a sense of visioning collective justice.
Mhm.
And even though that's a lot, it's trying to get to the person to understand that even their desire to win is not collective. Their desire to
Mhm.
persuade is not collective. It may be based on their own individuality that they're trying to convince this other person's reality to move forward. I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, thank you.
That
Um, Go ahead, Ben. Was that
I,
Ben or
I,
Abe?
it was me. I appreciate that going. It matches something I was thinking a minute ago as well. That there's this mindset that we encounter um, uh, that uh, politics, that freedom is a zero-sum game, and so often it is I have to hurt you in order to get something for myself, and it's from I mean it's how this country was founded on the idea, pushing the idea that poor white men could benefit by their association with the uh, uh, rich white men, the slave owners, by agreeing to things like the Three-Fifths Compromise and allowing slavery to continue even in this country built on the concept of freedom. Um, to the economic argument, my organization does a lot of work around the state budget and tax policy here in Maryland, and the conversations we have about who should benefit from government spending and who should pay for government spending. And I connect that with the conversation or what was happening in immigration enforcement, and earlier this year, where there was this whole conversation about, well, uh, whether or not people um, uh, interacting with the immigration system deserve due process. And well, if they're illegal immigrants, to use that phrase, uh, they don't deserve due process. Um, and in all of that, you have to willfully ignore the fact that each of us is closer to being homeless on the streets than we are to being Jeff Bezos.
Mhm.
Even the most wealthy of our neighbors is closer to being homeless than they are to being a billionaire. Each of us is closer to having our own privilege revoked in the service of this authoritarian tendency. Um, and I, as a citizen who was born in this country, if there's no due process and I get swept up into the immigration enforcement mechanism, I don't have the rights that are accorded to me by birthright citizenship.
Mhm.
And now we're talking about, maybe taking birthright citizenship away from people. The Trump administration is arguing this in front of the Supreme Court, that they ought to be allowed to take it away, uh, despite its presence written into our Constitution. Um, and one of the challenges we face at sort of all levels for those of us who care about justice is uh, helping people to understand that it's not a zero-sum game, for one thing, that we have the resources we need to for everyone to thrive. Um, I mentioned earlier about we were talking about the big, beautiful, horrible bill, and how skewed the benefits are to the rich in that bill. And in order to do that, we had to attack folks struggling to make ends meet, and how that's disproportionately falling on Black and brown communities. And if we just didn't do that, we wouldn't there wouldn't be a path to paying for those dramatic attacks. Not that they even paid for all of the terrible cuts that they made. Um, and that each of us is um, all of our privileges are very tenuous at best. And as a white man, my privileges may be the last ones to be attacked, but that doesn't mean that I might be attacked in other aspects of my who I am, of my uh, identity, and or for what I say politically. And we have to move people away from this zero sum game, us versus them thinking.
Thank you. This conversation is bringing up for me one thing that I again just recently read, and it is about this administration suing for voters' rights records. And suing, I think the number is up to 11 states, because they're saying no, that this is about the privacy of the voting booth. This is about, the way in which we have always operated in terms of those things that we consider sacred. And what goes on in the voter booth definitely is. So when you then bring up about, even as a white man, your those privileges on which you rely could be stripped away just by someone looking at what you say, or looking at, your voter records, or your voter records, Erica, or your voter records, John, or your voter records, Abe. That it doesn't even matter whether you're a good citizen or a contributing citizen, none of that, or a birthright citizen, none, or a naturalized citizen, none of that matters. What matters is whether people see you as a threat to what policies or laws they're pushing, or whether they don't. And in that scenario and landscape, nobody is safe and everybody is in danger. So the issues that we're talking about here, a case can be made that what we're talking about is a degree and time, because things don't just go to a point and then stop. The more people can get away with, the more they will try to get away with. And that is what is frightening people about the scenario right now. That is not just this, what's happening now. It is also those things that are being signaled to come. So I want, if we can, to talk about something that we really haven't talked about yet, and that is understanding that there are things that can come. Any one of us can be walking down the street or going to get groceries or going to our favorite bookstore or coffee or whatever, and we see right in front of us a person being snatched off the street. Or maybe it is we ourselves, right? Who are being profiled, or who are being profiled by how we look, or who have been surveilled because of what we say or where we work, who are now being targeted. What are our rights in those situations? And Abe, I'm looking squarely at you to be on first for this. What are our rights if we are the people being snatched off the street? And how can we be of best assistance if we are the people who are there watching?
That's I love that. So I do a lot of know your rights in the community, and I really appreciate you but bringing that up. I do want to make kind of like 2 points on what was said over, and then I can get into the
Okay.
rights.
Okay.
The white comfort. I think white comfort is like the biggest threat to our democracy, right? I just sort of feel that like that is the reason we have this regime sort of now. And I think that, there's a lot of messaging around there like America is so divided. They're so divided. But if you look at Black people's voting, right, Black people are not divided. White
Right.
America is divided, right? And white America is divided in a way that I don't think people should take on in that way, right? I think, like it's so I just wanted to just kind of make a note about what white comfort and how that builds sort of this narrative, like everybody is like fighting. It's like, no, there's like a very few section of folks. And then, Ben talked about sort of like even in the big bill, right? Who this benefits and all of that. And I think that like even with our economic policies, we're always thinking about that. Farmers right now, because of the tariffs, are going to get a $12 billion welfare check, right? So they're going to get bailed out. So like we got the money, it's just who it benefits. And I just wanted to make those 2 points. Now
Wait,
going on to
before you jump into that, just two things. White farmers,
white farmers,
majority
thank you
white
so much. Yeah.
farmers,
Yeah.
and the what you brought up, which I don't want us to slip on, is you talked about white America being divided. And Abe, in that statement is everything, because it really is how reflexively all of the conversations are from what is happening in white America, just reflexively. Because if it wasn't, then there would not be a statement that America is divided. Because as you pointed out, Black and non-Black people of color, well, that's not necessarily the whole story right there, right? Not in the way that it is for white America. So when our news media frames things and they make these statements such as, "Oh, America is divided, this," they never acknowledge that what is really being discussed is what is going on in white America and the impacts on white America, which makes other racial groups' realities disappear because those statements aren't realities for our groups. in the way that they're realities for white America. So immediately white America is affirmed, repositioned as the norm of what is happening with America as a whole, which means that everything else is just a side piece, divorced from what is happening in the main. And that is usually where we come into these conversations, right? Even the conversation about democracy and freedom, because by default what we're talking about is what has been happening for white America, the history of white America, and how white America is impacted. So I just wanted to put that on the surface where the cows can get it, because it was so profound in the truthfulness of the statement.
Appreciate that. No. That's great. Well, you guys, this is a great conversation. I want all my Saturday, mornings to be like this. Like I'm ready for the weekend. But yeah, so just a couple of things. I think, again, I want people to understand that they're not just taking immigrants, they're not just taking they're taking whoever is sort of involved in any type of situation. So the one thing I just always tell people, particularly for those that are going through the situation, right? It's your Fifth Amendment, right? Don't say anything all the time. Do not, if you're getting hemmed up, if they're like affecting you in any way, right? I think I always tell people you can say, "Am I free to go?" And then however way that that question gets answered will, determine the next 24 to 48 hours of your life, whether you are detained or whether you are not. If you are not, then go ahead and live your life. I always just tell people to not say anything. Your Fifth Amendment right is very, very important. Sort of in the streets when I do my note, I say shut the fuck up all the time. Do not say anything. The second part is memorize a number. I always tell this to people. I'm like, memorize a number that you can call. Because if you get taken and they find out you are a citizen, right? Everyone gets a right to a phone call. So if you're in there and you're like, I don't have my cell phone and I don't know who to call, just memorize a number. Some of us, I feel like, grew up memorizing numbers, but always memorize a number. And lastly, like, re record everything, right? And I don't mean like, if you have your cell phone out, but when you are going through, let's say that you're in the back of a van, let's say that they find out you're a citizen and you're the wrong person. Like in your mind, right? Try to tell yourself, I have to remember everything that's happening. I have to remember like how many officers are here. I have to remember what building they're taking me into. How many floors did I go up in the elevator? Like, right? All of these things for activists that are on the ground helps us understand, right? Particularly this was really big in Chicago, right? When there was a reporter from the Sun Times, the Chicago Sun Times, that got taken. She was, in a van, driven for 30 minutes. She was put in a room. So she like recalled all of that. So that helps with the lawsuits, that helps with everything that we want to do. So those are the three things, right? Don't say anything, shut the fuck up, right? Memorize a number. And as you're going through these whatever it is that you're going through, right? That detaining period, you want to just be in a space where you're like, you know what? I am going to retell this. I'm going to say what I am going through at some point so that for like the lawyers on the ground, when we, folks put in a lawsuit about what's happening to those that are being affected on it. And we also know, like, I'll give you an example. Like, we did not know that in LA they were using the Dodger Stadium parking lot to like have raids or whatever have you, right? We know that now. And so then the second part, right, which is like that's what you do if you're going through it, right? What
Wait,
happens?
can I ask a clarifying question? When you
Yeah,
say memorize a number, are you talking about a number of someone that you can call?
yeah, the phone number.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah, yeah. Somebody that you can call because they will give you a phone call. Your cell phone, either they'll hold it in property, or you might run out of battery, right? So these are things that we've learned from folks that have been sort of, a part of the large dragnet of things that they'll be in a situation and they'll be like, well, if you got a phone number, call it. And then you're like, I don't know any phone number. That's another 2 to 4 hours where,
Mhm.
like that you're going to be in there. So that's what I mean by a phone number.
Thank
Memorize
you.
a phone number. Yeah. If it's a local phone number, that's even better, that you'll be able to handle that. Um, and then I think as a bystander, right? What we've seen folks like if you see somebody getting arrested, a lot of this happens in like when people see landscapers, right? Or somebody that's working outside or whatever. You always want to film from a safe distance, right? We have something that we call salute, right? And it's an acronym. And it's an acronym for how to record and what to think about if you are recording an enforcement action. And I'm going to try to drop it in the chat right now. And basically, it is so that people understand that when you are filming the police, you have the right to do so, right? Um, and they might try to intimidate you. But you have the right to do so. I mean, again, our rights are fleeting at this point and we're losing them, but you do have a right to do it. You do have a right to film at a distance where they can't touch you. But so the salute acronym is the size, right? What is the size of the activity that's happening? A is the activity. Are there stopping Uber Eats drivers? Are they going on a bus, right? Are there, at Baltimore Penn Station, right? What is the activity that they're doing? The location obviously is important, right? The U stands for uniform. This is important because there's a lot of meshing of agencies right now, right? So, like I said, like the FBI is doing most of the immigration work, the DEA is doing most of the immigration work. So, we only know that because people were telling us the uniforms of the agencies that were taking. And then that's when we were like, hey, we think the DEA is actually with ICE out there. And that was correct. Uniform is really important. Time for obvious reasons. And the equipment, and this might be a little weird, but this is also very helpful because, in certain places they will have like SUVs, like large SUVs, right? And maybe long guns. We know that that might be the National Guard, right? So we also understand that, and I think in DC, again, when we're talking about equipment, at one point they were not armed, and then at another point they were armed, right? In DC where they were like, oh, you don't have to have it, and then they have it. So things get a little wild with that. And so I think for those of us on the ground, we're like, the equipment might also be helpful because what we're trying to do overall is trying to be informed and to try to protect the community, right? From what we're seeing where tear gases, are being, thrown at children's playgrounds as sort of what we see in Memphis. Again, Memphis does not get enough coverage, and it does because Memphis is actually, I think, one of the best examples of it being like this is not about immigration because they're just going in there, particularly African American males are just going through it right now with ICE, FBI, and all of that. And so what we're starting to see is things like us having more information, right? And on-time information is helpful. And lastly, I tell people to do this if you're comfortable. If you do see somebody getting sort of apprehended or whatever, you could always just yell, "Don't say anything, don't sign anything." And
Mm.
that will help out the person. Um, if I don't speak Spanish, but that might be a term that I like learn in Spanish. But don't sign anything and don't say anything. I think is helpful for anyone that you might see getting apprehended. And that's it. And again, it's know your rights. It's not necessarily like these rights are going to protect, it's not exercise your rights. It's just know it because there's so many violations that are happening. And in particular, they're taking everybody. Like it doesn't even doesn't matter about that. So I'll just stop there. But those
Thank
are
you.
yeah, those are
And and so what we know is that um, those authorities aren't necessarily following the law.
No.
And so when that is happening in real time, and I need you to racialize this, right? Because I think that it would be a different experience if Ben is observing than if Quentin
Yeah.
was observing.
Yeah.
And so, is there anything that you would tweak, change, offer to acknowledge the different ways in which authorities might engage with them during that experience?
Yeah. Remain calm, Quentin. Right.
Mhm.
I think the level of aggression and the level of violence, right, that they will feel very comfortable in sort of executing, right? I would just say is to remain calm. Other folks use the word de-escalate. I think that that's too inactive of a word, right? Because people might not know what that means. But I think when it comes down to Black people in this country, I mean, again, we've had this conversation. I'm sure Quentin had that conversation when he was a young man, right? I'm sure all of us as Black people have had that. It's the same conversation. It is literally the same conversation about remaining calm, right? And essentially trying to get out of the situation without any level of violence. And obviously, our interactions can remain, are fatal at times, right? And so I would just say the calmness that one has, and I know as a person that's, sort of has been in this, work for a little while, that's a big part of it, right? Those are sort of the natural instincts that I think for Black people, again, like, I go back to that Langston Hughes quote, like, we've been through this the whole time, and I think it's shining light for others to really see, right? About, oh my God, like, they're stopping Black people for traffic tickets more than they're not. And it's like, sort of we know that. So I would say to racialize it is those natural instincts to remain calm. You know that at the end of this, right, you want to be alive and well as much as possible and free if you can.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to just note the excellent resource that Erica dropped in the chat. Thank you so much. We've not heard from you, Erica, or from you, John. Is there anything in these closing minutes that you want to share or offer? Not pressuring, just trying to create space in case you want to.
I was just going to say this has been a great conversation. As a person, I live in Baltimore, but I work in DC, so I have seen the presence of the National Guards, and I've gone through the furlough, and it's just crazy times, really. And then to top it off, the holidays on top of it. So I don't know what to expect in the new year, but coming to spaces like this definitely helps me and validates what I'm feeling and going through. Because some people, I get it, it's a lot, and they just like, I can't deal with this, so they check out. So I get it, but for me, I'm checking in because it affects me. I can't turn a blind eye when you see, okay, I just left work and here is a group of National Guards outside my building, and then I get to Union Station to take the mark back home, and there's another group. And so it's like you get the sense that you're under a police state. And I'm like, how is anybody thinking this is normal? Because this is far. And I've been working in DC now like 10 years. So I got a little bit of the tail end of Obama. But it's like it's a great difference. It's not the same vibe, it's not the same anything. I mean, grant you the pandemic as well, but it's very unsettling. It's the best way I can describe it. It's unsettling, and people don't want to talk about it, or they don't know how to talk about it. So they just rather not say anything. So it's like, so you're stuck in this void and just like, okay, everybody just wants to put their head in the sand and not deal with this. How do I deal with this? Because I see this and I can't turn a blind eye and think this is normal. How can anybody else? So coming to these spaces helps. So thank you so much.
No, thank you. And this is why we have a commitment to these spaces. Because at BRJA, we know that any type of public space that people are feeling, as we all feel, fearful, not knowing what's going to happen. If we co have a space where people can come and speak on this. And this really is where the work begins. If these are principles and this is work to which we're committed, it's easy to do it when we're all feeling nice and safe. It's much harder to do it when like Abe and I were having a conversation earlier and saying, yep, we know we're cooked either way because our whole histories are out there online. And so, the more people that speak out, the more protection everyone is offered. So we appreciate you and appreciate your walking that walk in those fearful places, public spaces every day. Thank you, Erica. Thank you for being here. And John, anything, and then I'm going to turn to Ben and Abe to close us out. John, anything that you want to share, add, offer? Thank you, Quentin. Bye. We hope to see you again. John?
Yeah, I have a thank you everyone for the conversation and the resources in the chat. I have a number of different thoughts bouncing around, but I think the most relevant one is just this whole conversation is making me think about how I feel like people are often talking about. I feel like how do I phrase this? There's a lot of like news and like arguments and conversations around like politics in terms of like partisanship and so on. But I feel like we don't spend a lot of time talking about just what does governance looks like, what does like good like for example, like we're talking about budgets, and I feel like um obviously people are talking about this specific budget bill and like the damage it'll cause. But I feel like just the idea of like budgeting and like have we like created processes like budgeting processes, policy making processes, etc., that can encourage justice and equity, or like yeah, I'm just thinking about like how are the ways in which we have developed governmental processes. Does this work for or against the outcomes that we want to see?
So this kind of gets to what my final comment was going to be, Adar. Um, I wanted to share some of the opportunities we have in the next few months to fight back at a more structural level. And there definitely are opportunities. I mentioned before, I think here in Maryland we have more opportunities for fighting back than I have sister organizations in other states that are really in the thick of it in a much more dangerous way. Not that we do everything perfectly here or even well, but we do have opportunities, and we've over time, uh, uh, the government has become more transparent. Maryland's government has become more transparent about how it makes those decisions and who's benefiting from budget and policy decisions. And it's important for us, each of us, to take advantage of those transparency opportunities and pay attention to what's happening in Annapolis. The legislative session will start mid-January, and there are a number of ways in which Maryland policymakers can fight back on the issues that we're talking about today. My organization, which I put the link in the chat, as well as many others, will be pushing to fight back using all the tools that are available to Maryland lawmakers. There are definitely going to be conversations around making it illegal under state law for local jurisdictions to cooperate with ICE agents, for example, in these so-called 287G agreements. There are a number of ways in which Maryland law needs to be decoupled from federal law, because often we piggyback on federal law to make the lawmaking process easier, so that some of those terrible impacts from the federal tax law in particular don't flow down into the state level. Maryland, to the extent possible, needs to step up and fill in these gaps that are being created. Maryland lawmakers already backfilled some of the health insurance premium tax credits that are now expiring. So the impact here in Maryland is a little bit less dramatic than it is in surrounding states, but it's still bad. And we need to look for other opportunities, and not just in legislation or the budget process, but also in the administration of these processes, as we are forced to create significant red tape for SNAP and Medicaid recipients to go through. Like, we need our government workers who are trying the best they can to think creatively and partner with the community on ways in which we can minimize the harm of these new really onersome requirements, so that we minimize the number of people who are kicked off just because of paperwork, even if they qualify, for example. So definitely, we're in a lot of those different spaces, and certainly if you do a little research, you can also find organizations that are specifically working on those issues if there's one that's particular to you. But we absolutely, starting mid-January, have an opportunity that we should not let go to fight back and to ask our government to fight back.
Thank you. And we can also add some of these links, Ben and Abe, to the to our website or our YouTube channel as we post this event too. So if there are things in talking to you both that you want us to pay attention to and to make sure that our audience does, please send those to us and we will make sure to connect them as we publicize this 13th on social media and YouTube. Thank you, Ben. And Abe, your closing
Yeah,
statements?
yeah. But I mean, I'm really looking forward to those listed resources. Ben, I clicked on all of the ones you had on the side, but if we could get that together at some point, that'll be really wonderful. But I think I got some of the pages together, so I'll just go back. Yeah, I mean, I think like to leave it off what Bennett said about fighting back. It is what makes us human, right? Our rebellion, our resistance, right? That is what makes us who we are as human beings. It is the most human trait, right? Just like love, but it is the most human trait to fight back. And I'll leave with this. Just one thing that is bringing me a little bit of joy is that talking to a researcher friend of mine who researched sort of revolutions around the world, right? Basically said that it only takes 3%, right? It only takes 3% of a society, right, to transform it, right? And I think that that's really helpful because when we're throwing around numbers like 51% and this percent over there voted for this or whatever have you, but it just takes 3% of us, right, of our society that and we can make some real change, right? We can transform it to be more reflective of our reality. And I'll leave it on that note.
I love that. And I would just add, there is no person in this country who is powerless. Not one. That we all have places where we walk, spaces where we hold influence. If the only thing that we do is ask questions at the right time, asking questions, that is an act of resistance when we do it with intention and in a timely way, right? So we can all feel that we are impotent. We can all feel that there is nothing that we as individuals can do. Yet the power that we hold in our hands should never be questioned. It should only be used. So we thank you all for being here today, for taking some time out of your Saturday. And Ben
Thank
and
you.
Abe,
Yeah.
we knew you were going to bring it. Thank you so much for everything that you shared.
Well,
Just appreciating you all so
thanks to
much.
the folks that came out. Thanks to our fearless facilitator over here. Everybody, this is fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
And Ben, I think that that John gave us another 13th of the month. So we will be coming back to you as we talk about those governmental processes that influence and encourage good government. I think that would be such rich discussion. And Abe, we never lose anybody that we find. So
I'm
trust and
out
believe.
here. Yeah. Anything you guys need, just as a resource, and I'll be following up on all of this stuff that I learned today. And shout out to Maryland, and I think they're a better state having you guys in it. So appreciate it, Donna. Thanks for the tech work. I think everything went on without a hitch. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you
Mhm.
all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Yay. And I want to thank Adar before we
Yeah,
stop for
Yes.
her.
yeah.
Yes,
Appreciate you.
thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you so much.